Evil people don't always have a pointy tail and pointed horns and a pitchfork. We are told that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. The figures we're discussing, there's nothing fun about these people at all. It is the evilest people in history. Our top 10 evilest people in history. These guys would all be Democrats today. There's just no question. They would all have voted for Biden and Kamala. There's just no doubt. His ideas killed so many people and continue to do so. His ideas inspire things like BLM, for instance, inspires what we've been talking about that's taking place in China and North Korea and various other parts of the world. His ideas have killed more people than anyone else's except for number one on our list. And number one on our list is going to surprise you. It's the top 10 evilest people in history. Now, how do we arrive at this conclusion? Well, first of all, let me just simply say that the list is completely subjective. We could easily swap out various individuals. I mean, we could put somebody like Bill Gates or Fauci, on a list like this. There are a lot of people who could make our top 10 evilest list. But what I've tried to do is choose individuals where we have some distance, some history, where we can actually evaluate the totality of their lives and their deeds. And when I also say that it's subjective, I mean, how do you make a list like this? Are you choosing people just off of, just using raw numbers, the number of people that they killed, or their influence? Well, our list is a mix of both. It's how many people they killed, that they were responsible for killing, but is also a list of their influence. And I'm particularly interested in influence. I mean, this show's called Ideas Have Consequences for a reason, and that is because ideas have influence. And sometimes an idea that is floated upstream has devastating effects downstream. And so some of the people on my list will not surprise you. Others of them, I think, will surprise you probably a great deal. So starting at 10 and moving backwards, here is our top 10 list. We should have a drum roll. We don't. But we should have a drum roll that would be appropriate for each one of these names. Some of them, maybe we should have a gong, something like a gong, or a sound, one of those, one of those sounds that's like wah, 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 because none of these people deserve any kind of celebration. And some of them, oddly today, are still celebrated. So starting at number 10, we have the Kims. The Kims. Who are the Kims? Well, we're referring to Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. Now, this is a grandfather, son, grandson trio. Why are they on our list? Well, because of the absolute devastation that they have brought to North Korea. North Korea is one of the most repressive regimes in the world. The Korean War killed no less than 3 million people, and probably quite a lot more than that. And the Kims, and of course now we're down to Kim Jong-un, they've never officially ended the Korean War. They've never signed a peace treaty. They've never given any kind of indication that war is over, and indeed they carry it on in an ideological fashion. Now, interestingly enough, my father, he fought in the Korean War, and he said he would rather fight Vietnamese all day long than fight the North Koreans. And this is because the North Koreans put up machine guns behind their troops and indicated to them, if you turn back, we're just going to gun you down. So that tended to just press them forward. And he would say, you could bounce shells from a tank in front of them, which caused them to fragment and take out a whole swath of enemy soldiers. And he said, when the smoke clear, they just step over the bodies and just keep coming. I was in South Korea a few years ago, and South Korea has in many ways been an extraordinary success story, at least until recently, where we have martial law being declared. But when you go along the DMZ, that is to say along the 38th parallel, what you find there is not only that it's one of the most dangerous spots in the world because of a potential invasion from the north at any time, and of course the North Koreans are backed by the Chinese, but also because you will find, and I've been in them, tunnels that they have secretly built all along the DMZ in order to bring soldiers through and under the barbed wire that one finds there and invade the South. So the potential for war there continues. It has been a hot spot for more than half a century, and it will continue to be one for quite some time. But again, if your children are ever asking you, Dad, Granddad, what was the Soviet Union like? Just point them to North Korea. North Korea, again, one of the most repressive regimes in the world. And the evil of the Kims, grandfather, son, and grandson, that evil just continues. It's a domino effect. Number 9 on our list. It seemed to me that we needed to have someone from the Bible or a group of people from the Bible, and I chose to put the Sanhedrin of Jesus' day. And the reason for that is because what we find, those people who are responsible for convicting Jesus Christ, they got to be pretty evil, and I think they deserve to be on the list. But it isn't because of the sheer numbers of people that they killed. What amazes me about the Sanhedrin is that we are told, John chapter 11 records the story of the resurrection of Lazarus. And then we are told that a number of people came to see Jesus when they knew that the chapter 12 of John says that a number of people came to see Jesus when they learned that he was in Bethany and that Lazarus was there. And that because of Lazarus, John chapter 12, verses 11 and 12, I believe, state this, that because a lot of people were believing in Jesus, because of the resurrection of Lazarus, the Sanhedrin decided they needed to kill Lazarus. Think about this for a second. It's actually quite astonishing. People are showing up and saying, I hear that Lazarus, that guy was dead, and Jesus has raised him from the dead. And the Sanhedrin wanted to say, I don't think so. There he is right there. They were going to kill him again so that when people showed up to see the resurrected Lazarus, they could go, I don't think he's alive. I think he's dead. That speaks to extraordinary evil, meaning that it's not just that they didn't believe in Jesus, but they actually knew that Jesus was performing miracles. They actually knew the truth. And so hard-hearted were they that they were going to kill him anyway. I put the Sanhedrin on the list for another reason, and that is because they're representative, in a sense, of the entire human race. They kind of represent how we are all fallen, and we deserve to be on this list, and that is because we have evil in our hearts. We don't have to be restrained. An Enlightenment view saw human beings as basically good. A biblical view says, nope, you're not basically good. We don't have to restrain you from performing too many good deeds. We have to be restrained from our evil. We have an inherent evil that resides within us. And any of us who are honest enough to reflect on who we really are, we know that that is true about ourselves. We know that we have no hope apart from Jesus Christ. Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked above all things. Who can know it? In the last podcast, I was talking about our capacity for self-deception. We have an extraordinary capacity for self-deception. And that is because most of us like to think that our Lord, that he grades us on a curve. That we go, you know what? I may not be as good as some, but I'm better than most. And I fall somewhere in here on the good-o-meter. But the fact is, the Lord doesn't judge us on a curve. That's not the way it works. That is not the way we will be judged. We will be judged on our belief. Did we put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ, or didn't we? And we're at Christmas time, and seems to me that it's a good time to reflect on that question, because the Sanhedrin, it's easy for us to look at them and see how evil they were, and they were, because they recognized that Jesus was performing miracles, and undoubtedly they recognized that he probably was who he said he was. But you know what? They said, like a mafia, let's kill him anyway, because he's a threat to our power. I mean, the Sanhedrin, these guys would all be Democrats today. I mean, there's just no question. They would all have voted for Biden and Kamala. There's just no doubt. Okay, number 8 on our list is Ivan Grozney. Oops. Ivan Grozney. That looks like an R, but it isn't. It's a Z. Ivan Grozney. Grozney is translated from the Russian into English as terrible, and it's a terrible translation. But he was a terrible human being, so I suppose on this particular episode of Ideas Have Consequences, we'll let it slide. It really means something more like, more complimentary. Ivan the awesome. Ivan the fear-inspiring. Ivan the Terrible was the first czar of all the Russias, and he was, he lived from, I don't think we've listed the others here. They're all 20th century. The Sanhedrin, of course, first century. Ivan Grozney, Ivan the Terrible, he lived from 1530 to 1584, and typically historians divide his life into 3 periods. His period of minority, meaning where someone ruled on his behalf, from 1533 to 1547, so we can't really judge him for that period because he was too young. Then from 1547 to 1566, which is thought of as a period of, he was thought of as a fairly effective, progressive kind of czar. And then 1566 to 1584. In 1584, that's where he gets the moniker, at least in the Western world, terrible, awful human being. And what happened there? Well, there's been much speculation as to what happened to Ivan, that he, the last portion of his reign, the last roughly 20 years, 18 years, what happened? Well, his beloved wife, at least this is the way some tell the story, died in 1566, Anastasia, and supposedly was so grief-stricken by her death that he just went on a killing spree for the next 18 years of his reign. I mean, Ivan the Terrible is the kind of figure that on one occasion a messenger is sent to him, and Ivan doesn't like the message, and he's holding a staff that has a steel point on the end of it. And as the guy's speaking, he's leaning progressively harder and harder on the guy's foot until he's pinned it all the way to the ground. Just for the hell of it. That's the kind of guy that Ivan Grozney was. In 1570, he surrounded the Russian city of Novgorod in a 6 weeks orgy of violence. He almost exterminated the entire city. He used giant frying pans and went around the city telling the people to come out and greet their czar, where they were then executed. He himself participated in these executions with axes and with sticks and with whatever he could find. He enjoyed impaling people. This is the kind of figure that he was. And the reason his name isn't typically mentioned in a list like this is because when it comes right down to it, the numbers of people that he killed, it's not that many when you compare it to, say, Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler. But that's only because Ivan Grozney didn't have the modern means of extermination. I'm sure if he had Zyklon B, like they used in the extermination camps during World War II, he'd have killed millions. If he'd have had machine guns, he'd have killed millions. If he had had those kinds of means of warfare, of killing people, he'd have used them. He didn't even have the guillotine. Guillotine wasn't invented, for another 150 years. So there you go. Ivan Grozney, I think, definitely belongs on our list. A little interesting factoid about Ivan, he proposed, a contemporary of his was Queen Elizabeth the First, the so-called misnomer, if ever there was one, the Virgin Queen. He proposed to her. And Elizabeth wisely, graciously declined the honor of being the wife of one of the worst individuals of the 16th century. So Ivan Grozney makes our list. Number 7 on our list. Drum roll, please. Number 7. Lenin. Lenin could easily, could slide up and down on this scale. He could be over here. We'll put him over here. And that's just because he didn't live long enough to kill enough people. To just sheer numbers, he wasn't able to pull it off. But Lenin, the Bolshevik, the founder of the Russian Revolution, who toppled the Romanov dynasty. He was born in 1870 and he died in 1924. And Lenin is often thought of when we come to Soviet history, when we start talking about communists. He often is thought of as kind of the warm, fuzzy Bolshevik, the warm, fuzzy communist, and that's because he criticized Stalin. Seeing that he was dying, he wrote this letter in which he spoke of Stalin as kind of a rough, crude, vulgar man. He didn't speak of him as a murderous brigand, which of course he was. He just said, look, he's too rough around the edges. And so many people who want to defend Bolshevism, who want to defend communism and socialism, they say, it would have worked if he had lived. Unfortunately, he didn't, and Stalin took over and it all went to hell. But if he had lived, it'd have been okay. No, it wouldn't have. He had no problem exterminating all of the Romanovs. He killed the Nicholas II, ordered the killing, the execution of Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra and their children, Olga, Maria, Tatiana, Anastasia. Yes, she was killed too. She did not survive. And Alexei. Killed them all. Had no problem with that. Had no problem with surrounding whole villages and machine gunning them. He had no regard for human life. And Lenin was an awful human being. Yet to this day in Red Square, people will line up, sometimes for more than a mile, at the Lenin Mausoleum, just outside the walls of the Kremlin, and they will go through. You walk through, and you see the remains of Lenin. And I like the way P.G. O'Rourke puts it. He's preserved there like a bad salad under a sneeze guard. That's what he looks like there. I mean, he's mostly wax these days, and the way they light it up, it looks kind of weird, and it's like he's an exhibit in a freak show. These days, I don't know how many of those people go because they adore Lenin, or it's just like, hey, let's go see something kind of bizarre and weird and go see this dead maniac, which of course he was. But he definitely belongs on our list because he led the Russian Revolution, toppled the Romanov dynasty, or at least played a role in that, seized power in the so-called October Revolution, which was actually, did you know this? It was actually November in the Western world. And that is because the Russians still used the old Julian calendar, which was 13 days behind the Western world, which was using the more modern and up-to-date and accurate Gregorian calendar, named after Pope Gregory, which factored in leap year. But you see, the Julian calendar did not factor that in. It was using a Euclidean calculations, which were pretty amazing, that said, it takes 365 days for the earth to go around the sun. But it's actually 365 and a quarter days. And so over the course of years, you start losing more and more days. So the so-called October Revolution was actually in November in the Western world. But it's just like Russians to be behind on everything. behind on everything. And they were 2 weeks behind the Western world in the literal sense and 2 centuries behind when it came to things like, say, the Industrial Revolution. You got to bear in mind when we're talking about Russia, why is Russia so different? It is because Russia never had a Renaissance. They never had a Reformation. They never had an Enlightenment. They never had a scientific revolution, and barely had an industrial revolution. Those were all things that convulsed and changed the West. And that is because they were separated from the West linguistically. You see, in 988, the Russians adopted Greek Orthodoxy as their religion, which, of course, Greek and the Russian language, which didn't have an alphabet, was adopted as a Cyrillic alphabet, to the Greek alphabet rather, creating the Cyrillic alphabet. So they were cut off from the West linguistically, and all the changes, the aforementioned changes, all came through the Latin Church. They all came through the West, and they missed out on all of them. But this guy here definitely deserves to be on this list. But in some quarters, he is still revered. You can go in. I was in Cuba, maybe 2 years ago. I was in Cuba, and you see his image around. Mostly you see Fidel's image, some of Che Guevara, but you see a lot of Lenin. And that's because he's being held up by the state as a model. The next one, I won't say it, but I'll let you see it, because I have to be careful here. I mean, if you watch this show, you know that we are being on this channel. But anyway, here we go. This guy here, this is a real SOB. Now, my friend, Jay Smith, and you got to watch Jay Smith. Jay is an expert when it comes to Islam. He has demonstrated quite convincingly that this fellow may never have actually really existed in real space-time. But we will, for the sake of our list, assume that he did, that he's not just a composite figure, but that he's a real individual. This is a guy who, unlike Jesus Christ, he had multiple wives. Jesus didn't. He fought in and led some 80 battles. Jesus didn't. He was in favor of underage girls, and again, I got to be careful the way I say it here, but doing things that are quite illegal with underage girls. Jesus didn't. He was a man of war. Jesus was a man of peace. All these things. I mean, it's quite a contrast when you compare these two individuals who represent two separate religions. One of them, God is a God of grace, and the other one, he isn't. He's arbitrary. I mean, these are things to bear in mind. But when you take this religion seriously, and most of the people that you know who adhere to this religion, they don't take it seriously. They're like Methodists, really, when it comes right down to it. I mean, they don't really take their holy literature, their holy book, particularly seriously. And so they're not really reading the Quran or the Hadith, and certainly not modeling themselves, their lives, after this individual, as they're commanded to do so. And it's a good thing. We do not want them to model themselves after this guy, and that's because this guy here, like those preceding him on this list, was a maniac, you see. And that's why so much violence has been set loose upon the world, and particularly now, we are seeing it in the Western world on a scale we've not seen it since the Muslims invaded Europe in the 8th century. And by the way, when people want to bring up the Crusades, I'm sick of hearing about the Crusades, like the Crusades were some kind of awful thing. The Muslims invaded Europe 300 years earlier. There had to be a response to that. It took 300 years, but eventually they did respond. So there's a question of chronology that people forget, in that our media doesn't want to report or discuss. I mean, they dominated Spain for, almost 700 years. So, I mean, this is history that frequently that you are not being told. But what we are seeing taking place in the Western world, when we're talking about scandals like Rotherham, when we're talking about many of the terrorist acts that we're seeing in the Western world, started here. It started with this guy. And in a sense, it started back here with, I don't mean the Sanhedrin, rather I mean evil human nature. I mean, he gave justification to evil. He just gave justification to men to do what they wanted to do anyway, which is to seize women, do whatever they want with them, to commit violence, to lie. You can do all of that, provided that it is for their God. So he definitely deserves to be on our list. And again, like Lenin, he could be higher on the list, but there's so many maniacs in history that it's hard to get Maniac of the Year, Maniac of all time on our top 10 list because there are so many. Okay, so number 5 on our list is, drum roll please, it should be a drum roll that's kind of guttural. And that's because German is guttural. And that's because the next guy on our list is, can you guess? Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler. By the way, I didn't say this, but he lived from, from 570 to 632. So that's when he lived. So the 6th and 7th centuries. This guy here, he lived from, I would have put the dates over here, but I don't leave myself enough room. But he lived from 1889 until April 30 in 1945. And no, he did not survive. There's a lot of interesting little books that you can read about Hitler's survival narratives that are very interesting because post-war, what happened? Well, I'll come to that in just a minute. First, let me explain to you why he's evil. Now, most of you know a fair amount about Adolf Hitler, and that's because if you go to the History Channel, also known as the Hitler Channel, you will find loads of documentaries about this guy. He has been the inspiration of endless thrillers, endless spy fiction, endless histories, biographies, on and on and on. If you want to read interesting biographies of him, I would point you to Alan Bullock, who is one of the biographers of Hitler, and Joachim Fest. That's Joachim Fest. Both of them terrific biographies. I also point you to a book that I've had on my table. Here, let me grab it real quick. What do you know? I have a couple of these books all just sitting right here. So here's Joachim Fest's Hitler, which is superb. And then this book, which interestingly enough has caused a little bit of controversy because people see it sitting on my desk like this. And they see the swastika. And idiots assume that that must mean I like swastikas and that I'm a Nazi. The book is called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, A History of Nazi Germany. And the author of this book, William Shirer, this is superb. And by the way, the Audible version is, I've read it a couple of times and I've listened to it probably 3 times. It's great. The guy who reads it, I'm pretty picky about Audible books because I like if I can't stand the reader, it's hard for me to listen. And the reader of this particular book is one of my favorite narrators, and that's Grover Gardner. So you can find this on Audible. It's very, very good. And he was a journalist in Germany through the 1930s, and I think he left Germany in 1940. So he was an eyewitness to much of what was taking place. Hitler's rise to power, attended a number of the speeches, met a number of the principal figures of that time, and that book has remained a classic since its publication. And I think maybe the late 60s is when it was first published. Anyway, doesn't matter. Adolf Hitler is on our list. All of you, if you paused at the beginning of this episode and said, you know what, somebody said they were going to do this, when I said that I was going to do this episode, someone said on YouTube, I'm going to make my own top 10 list and see if I can guess your list. You can pause now and see if you can figure out the other 4. Bet you don't. Guess who the other 4? Well, you'll guess some of them, maybe most of them, but I bet you don't guess them all because number one is going to surprise you. You got to hang tight for number one. But everybody's list would have had Hitler on it. And that's because when you start talking about the evilest people in history, bang, his name immediately comes up. And yet, I don't have him at number one. I think most people probably would assume that he is at number one. Hitler's reason for being on the list is pretty obvious. I mean, he instigated World War II and the Holocaust, which killed roughly 8 million people, 6.5 million Jews, and about 1.5 million others. I've been to several of the concentration camps. I've been to Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Mittelbau Dora, where they were building the rockets, the Aggregate 4, also known as the V2, the Vengeance 2 rocket, Mauthausen, number of other places where these things were taking place. But Adolf Hitler's regard for human beings was, well, non-existent. It really was non-existent. And one of the things I think we do ourselves a disservice regarding Hitler is we look back upon him as a monster, which of course he was in terms of his actions. But in doing that, I don't think we're really learning much about how he came to power. I spent a couple of summers ago, I read several memoirs by people who are close to him. I was reading, a biography, a couple of biographies of Eva Braun, and then I read the memoirs of his valet and his chauffeur and a couple of other people. And you know what? They loved him. They loved him. And that should scare you, because that means that evil people don't always have a pointy tail and pointed horns and a pitchfork. We are told that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. He disguises himself as an angel of light. There is a reason why Lenin had such an enormous following and continues to have an enormous following. A lot of people who are close to him liked him. Adolf Hitler's, those people who are close to him, many of them love him. One of the most intriguing post-war memoirs is that by Albert Speer. Albert Speer came from a good family. He was well-educated. He was an architect. He was never a part of the Hitler Youth. His mind hadn't been warped by all of that. And his memoir is titled, he was sentenced to 20 years at Nuremberg. If he had been a rocket scientist, he'd have gotten 0. But you know what? America didn't need architects. We had lots of architects. So he got 20 years. But he wrote a memoir that's called Inside the Third Reich, which was made into a terrific film with Derek Jacobi. I don't think it's available on any services right now. I ordered it. I ordered a DVD off of Amazon, and I had to find a used copy of it somewhere because it's a miniseries that came out in the 1980s. And the miniseries is based on Speer's own memoirs, again, called Inside the Third Reich. Fascinating. And that series stars, what's Gwyneth Paltrow's mother's name? Forgotten her name. Danner or something like that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Her mother is in it, plays Albert Speer's wife. Rutger Hauer plays Albert Speer, and you also have, I think John Gielgud is in it. It is really quite superb. But what's interesting about the memoir is that Speer quite credibly lays out what happened and acknowledges the evil of Hitler, and then says, like, he doesn't deny the Holocaust, he then says, when he learned that Hitler had killed himself, he cried. He cried. The power of Adolf Hitler was the power of persuasion, the power of seduction. Now, skills like that can be used for good. I think Jesus was a very effective and persuasive preacher, spokesman, teller of jokes, of parables. Very effective. That can be used effectively. If you have such gifts, you must use them effectively. But they can also be used and harnessed for great evil. And Adolf Hitler did. World War II, which again he provoked, saw the deaths of no less than 50 million people, maybe as many as 60 million people globally. So Hitler deserves to be on our list. Now, what you're wondering right now is, good grief, if Hitler is at 5, who could possibly be at 4, 3, 2, and 1? Who could possibly be there? You know what? I need to get the curve out of the way here so that I can leave some room for number 1 on the list. So who's number 4 on our list? Number 4 is Stalin. Joseph Stalin. I only put him above Hitler because he lasted longer and he killed, therefore, a lot more people. If we're going sheer numbers, Stalin killed, Solzhenitsyn puts the number of the Nobel Prize winner for literature, the Russian dissident writer, he puts the number at about 60 million. I think Robert Conquest at the Hoover Institute, he puts the number at about 30 million during the Great Terror. Point is, he killed a lot of people. And this guy here was almost pure evil. The kinds of things that he did. He lived from, as I was saying, from 1889 to April 30, 1945. Stalin lived from, when was he born? 1878, I think. He was born in 1878 and died in March 1953. His reign from the late 20s until March of 53, and he terrorized not just his native country, he terrorized the whole of Eastern Europe and had absolutely no problem with the tactics of his own NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB. And, when Russian soldiers marched into Berlin in the waning days of World War II and raped no less than 100,000 German women, when Stalin was asked about that, he said, was to prevent a soldier from having a little trifle. That's what he thought of. That's what he thought of rape. It was a trifle. It was just a big nothing. So what? Let them boys will be boys. Let them have a good time. That was the way he saw the whole thing. Joseph Stalin was an evil individual. He went to seminary, and some people have tried to turn that into, he wasn't an atheist. Joseph Stalin, I love the way Solzhenitsyn puts it in the first circle. He didn't believe in God. The way he puts it is something like this, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's quite powerful. He says that Stalin's never trusted really anyone. He didn't trust his parents. He didn't trust the God to whom he was to bow in seminary. He didn't trust his wife. He didn't trust his lieutenants. He didn't trust Lenin. In a life of distrust, Joseph Stalin trusted one man and one man only. And he turned and he offered this man the hand of friendship while the whole world watched. And that man was Adolf Hitler. The two of them struck a deal in 1939 with what became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 10-year non-aggression pact, and that was Hitler's way of securing his eastern border so he didn't end up in a nightmarish two-front war. He didn't want to fight in the West and in the East at the same time, so he secured the East by striking a deal with Stalin, and then he launched an attack on France in March of 1940. Thing is, Stalin, having truly trusted Hitler, he did. He really did. A man who never trusted anybody but him, of all the people in history to trust. And then guess what? How was his trust rewarded? On June 22nd, 1941, 4.5 million men, 175 divisions crossed the Russian frontier in what became known as Operation Barbarossa. And the result would be that because of Stalin's idiocy and his poor leadership, his poor generalship, no less than 25 million Russians, roughly half the casualties of World War II. You know, we like to think this Private Ryan saved the war. Think about this. The Russians lost more people in Stalingrad than we lost the entire war. They lost more people in St. Petersburg in a 900-day siege than we lost in the entire war. It's incredible. Stalingrad was the real turning point of the war, not the Normandy invasions, as important as they were and as heroic as they were. But again, roughly half the casualties of World War II were Russian. And as if that weren't enough, Stalin killed millions of Russians, millions of Ukrainians, millions of Eastern Europeans through state-engineered famines, collectivization, purges, and a reign of terror. And again, he could slide up and down this scale. I'm convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that if Lenin had lived longer, he would have been, he'd have killed as many as these two. He just didn't. And the result is he kind of gets off the hook. People look at him and go, such a nice guy. I would really love to have, had coffee with him and chat. The nice communist. There's no such thing as nice communist. So, Stalin, here we are. Next on our list. Could you guess who's next? Because at this point, we're just going, the way we arrange them is really based on raw numbers. And with that in mind, the next figure is, you can probably guess, Mao. Mao Zedong. Mao belongs on our list, and that is because Mao, he made these guys look like schoolboys when it came to sheer numbers of people that he killed. I want to share a little story. Years ago, some of you will know I've mentioned sort of offhandedly that I am not allowed in China. I tried to go the last time I tried to go was, I think in 2016, and maybe it was 2017, doesn't matter. And I was denied entrance unless the Chinese said I had to sign an agreement stating that I would not write or say anything negative, that I would come and basically sing China's praises. I was like, fat chance of that. I'll just trash you anyway because I've already been in China. And this was when I was preparing to write the book Around the World in More Than 80 Days. This book right here, which makes a great Christmas gift, ladies and gentlemen. It feels like an infomercial right now. You can buy this book. I wish I had Vanna White to do this. This makes a great Christmas gift right here. It's full of adventure. It's my travels to, I think, 26 countries in this book that you'll find interesting. But one of the stories I tell about China is this. I was in Beijing, and I was at the University of Peking. And this is in 2010, which some of you will remember was a period that was thought of as, the China was liberalizing. Churches were being constructed and Christians were becoming much more open about practicing their faith. And there was even some criticism of Mao. And so I'm at the University of Peking, and I am participating in a lecture with a Chinese economist. And this guy, at the same time I was two students were leading me around the university and giving me a tour. So as I'm listening to this economist, he says this. He makes a reference to Mao, and he says that there were excesses during Mao's reign, which was truly a reign of terror. And I felt my heart beating. I found myself becoming a little agitated, little beads of sweat. I thought, I can't let that slide. Excesses? And so I raised my hand and I said, excuse me, there's more than excesses. Mao killed roughly 70 million of his own people. The economist, when I said this, you could have heard a pin drop. And he's standing up front, in front of his lectern, and he looks at this door, and then he turns to look at this door as if to see, did anyone hear me say that other than the people in the room? And then he continued on like I'd said nothing at all. Like I had said nothing at all. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what fear looks like. That's what I call historical, generational fear looks like. Generational fear, and as I mean it, is you weren't alive when Hitler or Stalin or Mao were around, but your parents were, and they've told you the stories, and that fear continues on in you, and it continues on in your children. And the result of that is that you're very, very careful. You're very, very careful. And that's what generational fear looks like. The guy didn't feel like he could respond to what I was saying. And the two students who had been leading me around the university, the chairs we were sitting in are like office chairs that rolled. They both kind of like rolled away. I felt like I was, either Dathan or Coram, or Cora. And that God was about to open the earth and take me, except it would be communist God, which means it would be, say Lenin who would do that. But anyway, that was, it was an extraordinary event. And none of these Chinese wanted to be near me the rest of my tour. And so fast forward 6 years, and when I want to come to Beijing and Shanghai again, the Chinese say, nope, not you, unless you sign this document. Now, there's probably another reason they didn't want me in the country, and that is because of the people I was associating with. Undoubtedly, they were following everywhere that I went and didn't like those associations. So the result was that I was not let in the country again. But again, generational fear. People like this inspire it. When I was in Russia for the first time in the early 90s, and again, this is after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm talking to a Russian woman, and I happen to mention the crimes of Stalin, and she pulls me aside. We're standing in a park, and she looks around, and she says, I've read about these things, and I've heard they're true. And I'm thinking, wow, this is generational fear. A friend of mine, a musician, he's probably about my age, but I remember a conversation with him in which he said that he was raised in Poland, in communist Poland. And his parents, he said, whenever we drove anywhere, our parents would not let us take our shoes off. Like, you're going for a 5-hour drive and you want to take your shoes off in the car. Parents would say you can't do that. And I said, why would they do that? And he said, because they told us you never know when you might have to run. His parents had known first from the West the Nazi invasion of their country, so they lived under Nazi oppression, saw the genocides, and then the Nazis were driven out by the communists and they lived under communist rule until the communists themselves, 1989, all that was taking place in Poland at that particular time. But the memory of that generational fear lingered in them to this very day, so that he says, even now, I'm kind of afraid to take my shoes off because you never know when you might have to run into the forest and hide. That's generational fear. And Mao absolutely inspired it. Mao, like these two, he had no problem killing people, none whatsoever. Had no conscience about killing human beings and killed as many as 70 million Chinese. Number 2 on our list, can you guess? I'll give you a second. We need to play the Jeopardy music. Dun, 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 dun. Who's next on our list? The next person on our list, who, by the way, never killed anyone to my knowledge. So now we're talking about, these guys, we're talking about sheer numbers right here. Raw numbers. That's the only way to arrange them, really. But when you're talking about influence, this guy has killed way more. And that is because he inspired these guys to some extent. And that is Karl Marx. Did I put Karl Marx on my list will make some people mad. He lived from 1818, I believe, to 1818 to 1883. And Marx's influence is so pernicious. And he is a guy, if you've watched some of my videos where I went in London and I went to the cemetery where there's a monument, his tomb is, and you see people coming and putting flowers. I wanted to urinate there. Forgive me, but Karl Marx is one of the most evil individuals who ever lived. If you want to read, a very readable little book in which he's included, it's not a biography of Karl Marx. It's a book called Intellectuals by Paul Johnson. It's a superb book. Again, Marx is just one of several that's included in the book, little short biographies of these individuals and their influence, their evil influence. I think entirely, I'm trying to remember if there were any people in that book that he had anything nice to say about. I can't recall. It's been maybe 20 years since I read it. The next book that I would recommend is Paul Kengore's book. Paul is an associate of mine. I think very highly of Paul, and his work is called The Devil and Karl Marx. I just finished reading that book. It's very, very good, and it's very insightful. It's explaining the real demonic influence in Karl Marx and in his life. You should take a look at some of his poetry. Just look up the poetry of Karl Marx. See if that's the kind of stuff you want to read, to your girlfriend or to your wife, as you're wooing her. I don't think so. This stuff is evil. It's truly evil stuff. But Karl Marx not only lived an evil life, his influence continues down to this day through things like Das Kapital and really most notably through the Communist Manifesto published in 1848. The Das Kapital, the first volume, was published in 1867, but successive volumes were published posthumously. And you won't find Das Kapital particularly readable, but the Communist Manifesto is quite short. It is quite readable, and you will immediately begin to perceive if you read it, and I think you get it for free. There's no Karl Marx estate that the money's going to, so don't worry about that. But you can probably download it for free or just go on the web and read it on the web. But it's fairly short, but you'll immediately begin to perceive the evil of this guy. But the reason I put him above them is not because he killed so many people, but because his ideas killed so many people and continue to do so. His ideas inspire things like BLM, for instance, inspires what we've been talking about that's taking place in China and North Korea and various other parts of the world. His ideas have killed more people than anyone else's except for number one on our list. And number one on our list is going to surprise you. Let me just go over here to the peanut gallery. You've already seen it. You know who's number one on my list. Dang, that's too bad. I'm looking over here at at our producer and others over here to see if the tech crew had any idea that who's at number one, and they do know because they're actually, they've actually seen this before. By the way, I have this in article form. I published an article about this with the American Spectator, I think in 2019. But I have him at number one, and the reason I have him at number one is because I had this list just as you see it, but with our next individual at number one. But the Spectator didn't like it. They were like, no, you can't put him at number one. He doesn't belong at number one. I was like, no, he absolutely does belong at number one. But they didn't want me to put it. So I had to take him out and bump everyone up a notch, which left a space empty, and I put Margaret Sanger in that space. Margaret Sanger deserves a spot up here too. It's just I only have 10. But Margaret Sanger, who's the founder of Planned Parenthood. So absolutely evil individuals, which the feminists don't want to acknowledge. But she was unbelievably an evil human being. But number one on our list, who is it? No one's going to be able to guess this. It looks like Parr. Looks like I'm saying Charles Parwin. There may be a Charles Parwin somewhere in the world. Charles, Mr. Parwin, I mean no offense. You are not on my list. Charles Darwin, however, is on my list. Now you may say, to borrow the name of another show I do, WTF. Why would you put Charles Darwin at number one on your list? I mean, Charles Darwin, his family loved him, and he had lots of friends, and he has a huge fan base today. He's taught in schools, and maybe in reality, he might have been an actual nice guy. Like, we don't think of him as evil in the way that we think of these individuals, or even as Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a real a-hole. I mean, almost no one liked Karl Marx, the people who knew him. Even Marx's longtime collaborator, his friend Friedrich Engels, his own private writings about Marx, there's not much in them that's fairly complimentary. He disliked him quite a lot, spoke of him as a devil. And I think Karl Marx, by the way, was possessed. These individuals probably too. Darwin, I don't think of like that. But I put him on this list because his ideas inspired all of these ideas. And this one. Now, he lived, obviously, long before Charles Darwin. So did Ivan Grozney. The Kims, they're over here too. They're absolutely were influenced. We could say they were also influenced, and that's because communism is driven by these ideas. In the previous episode of Ideas Have Consequences, I told you that Marx wanted to dedicate the first volume of Das Kapital, of Capital, as it translates to English. He wanted to dedicate the first volume to Charles Darwin. And Darwin, because they were contemporaries, Darwin was like, thanks, but no thanks. He was like Queen Elizabeth turning down the proposal from Ivan Grozney. Thanks. I'll decline the dubious honor. And that's because Darwin undoubtedly could see where this was going. But what Darwin didn't see, or at least not publicly acknowledge, is that Darwin's ideas, which I've told you that the year 1859 was absolutely a watershed moment in Western history, because that is when he published The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the struggle for survival among the most favored races, as it is sometimes called. What Darwin did here was he severed the last remaining tie, intellectual tie, between humanity and beliefs in moral absolutes, that there is a God in the next world to judge us for our actions in this one. And that's because he came along and he offered, I like the way Huxley put it, not Thomas, but Aldous Huxley. Huxley said, and I don't have the quotation right in front of me, but he said that the reason people adopt atheism, and he said that Darwin made atheism intellectually credible. He said the reason people adopt atheism, it isn't for any reason except one. They want personal liberty to do whatever they want to do. They want to do whatever they want to do. And Huxley was honest enough to say this. William Provine, an evolutionary biologist, late evolutionary biologist at Stanford University, he said that evolution is the most powerful engine of atheism ever invented. And you see, atheism drives all of these views. These right here, those are socialist in the sense of communist. This is socialist in the sense of fascist. I told you last week that you've been lied to when you've been told that fascism is somehow an expression of the extreme right, and that communism or socialism, Marxism, are an expression of the extreme left. They're both on the left. They are bastard children. They are twin ideologies, but they're on the same side of the ideological spectrum, and that is because they're both arrive at the same place, which is totalitarianism. You can't go in the opposite direction of totalitarianism and arrive at totalitarianism. You just can't. So these are all driven by atheism, and this one is too. And so is this. So is this. When we look at the most evil people on our list, they were heavily influenced. They're all post-1859. And they are individuals who are heavily influenced by Darwin's a naturalistic explanation for existence, for the natural order, human and otherwise, because he said, guess what? There was absolutely nothing, and then poof, there was something. There was a single-celled organism, and then that organism became more and more complex, and then bang, here we are. I mean, honestly, it's idiocy. But Charles Darwin is number one on my list, not because he killed anyone personally, but because Charles Darwin's ideas led to all of these. It led to all of them. It gave birth to all of them, and that's because his philosophy was atheistic, and so was theirs, so was his. So Marx influenced these guys. Darwin influenced them all. And that is because of his atheistic explanation for the world. And they then created ideologies that just played off of that. They're just branches. If we were to make an ideological tree, Darwin would have to be, maybe I'll do this. I just came up with this right now. Maybe we could sell a little book. We could call it the ideological tree. And the ideological tree, the trunk would have to be, let me repeat that. The evil ideology tree, the trunk would have to be atheism. And then off of it is an enormous limb. Maybe I'd make the roots atheism. And the trunk is Charles Darwin. And then off of that, we have Karl Marx. And off of that limb, we have Stalin and Mao. And then we have another limb with Hitler on it and the Kims and so forth. But that's who's number one on our list. I'm interested in knowing, when you go into the comments, I'm interested in knowing who you'd put on our list. Is there anybody going over here to the tech crew? Guys, is there anybody that you would put on your top 10 list that I didn't mention?
You already mentioned her.
Margaret Sanger? Margaret Sanger? Anyone else that we should put over here that you can think of? Have you got any ideas of anybody who might belong here? Margaret Sanger is a good one. There are more modern figures. There are some who would put Fauci on this list. And maybe in 10 or 15 or 20 years, we might look and go, you know what? He does belong on this list. Not prepared to put him there just yet, because I want to let all this shake out. There are some who'd put, say, somebody like Putin on this list. Frankly, you might say a Zelensky could belong here. You could put an Obama on here because of his pernicious influence, which has almost destroyed an entire country, and with it, the ripple effect, several other countries. We could also put, we could put a figure like, say, Robespierre, who was we could call him the chairman of the so-called Committee for Public Safety. Isn't that an incredible name? The Committee for Public Safety, a massive misnomer. The Committee of Public Safety oversaw the French Reign of Terror and sent roughly 20,000 people to the guillotine. They would have, Robespierre, it also falls into the category of a von Grozney, they'd have killed way more than 20,000 people that had Zyklon B or machine guns or tanks or, bombs, but they didn't. So they had to kill them one at a time, and that made it much more clumsy in order to do that. But Robespierre could easily belong on our list. Are there any others? I've had some people say that like Kaiser Wilhelm could be on here. No, he doesn't belong on a list like this. There are others who look back at, say a figure like Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, it could easily be put on a list like this. And then there are a lot of other figures for the Bible that we could go to who are, terrifying individuals or individuals who committed such extraordinary evil. Some would want to put, say, Judas Iscariot on this list, or perhaps Herod on a list like this. But I decided to make it a combination, ladies and gentlemen, of numbers and influence. And influence affects the numbers. So while they didn't kill anybody this is part of what I want us to learn from this. These ideas were set loose upstream. And then downstream, he added to it And they each added to it. And then it just kept until it became a torrent, an anti-human torrent that just wiped out hundreds of millions of people. Idi Amin, we could put a figure like that on here. Some people would maybe put a mass killer like a Jeffrey Dahmer. If a Jeffrey Dahmer had been a head of a state and had the power to mutilate millions of people, he'd have done it. He just was never in that position to do so. And that's why, by the way, this is also subjective, because if Hitler had managed to get into architectural school, we might never have known him. He probably wouldn't have killed anybody. He probably would have just lived out his life as a curiosity to people, a mediocre architect or artist, painter, who occasionally you'd find on a street corner ranting about the world. But you just kind of go by and go, yeah, whatever, buddy. He'd be a guy today who'd have a YouTube channel, not like mine, but he would have a YouTube channel where he'd be spouting his nonsense. By the way, a fascinating little movie. It's a German movie, controversial German movie that came out maybe 10 or 15 years ago. It's called Look Who's Back. And it's you may say, how in the world could you make a comedy with Hitler? But it is a dark comedy, and it's a comedy that's making a point that by some cosmic freak accident, Hitler arrives in modern day. And no one at first recognizes him. They just think he's a crackpot who thinks he's Hitler. But as he begins to garner a following and to march around Germany, people start going, I don't know, he may really be Adolf Hitler. Now, I need to warn you, because the film, in fact, this helps me date it. I think the film came out like in 2016, 2017. And what they're trying to do is to suggest that Donald Trump, they don't say it, but it's pretty obvious that Donald Trump is, you just have to ignore that nonsense. But the film itself is actually quite interesting because it is showing his power and his influence. And the guy that they all kind of initially brush off as a crackpot, they're discovering that crowds listen to what he has to say and they find him very persuasive. And he manages to tap into their sense of victimhood and their innate hate. And that's not Donald Trump. That's the Democrat Party. That's the Democrat Party. But anyway, when you're talking about subjective, again, my list, I'm not maintaining my list is perfect. There are a lot of people that I wrestled with putting on this list that I thought I would like to add. I've also known a few people that in my weaker moments, I thought, that guy is such a jerk, I'm going to put him on my list. But I didn't. What were you going to say?
Mengele.
Joseph Mengele. Mengele is a good one. Joseph Mengele could easily go on this list in terms of his own personal sheer evil, not the numbers of people, but just his sheer evil, known as the angel of death at Auschwitz. He played a role in the selection when they would unload from the Jews would arrive via train and unload, and they would be marched in circle. He would be one of the people selecting who lives and who dies, who's able-bodied enough to work, and who they should just take straight away to the gas chambers. Absolutely belongs on a list like that. When I was at Pitești prison in Romania last year, the things that were done to Christians, this was a communist prison that I talk about in a previous episode of Ideas Have Consequences, the kinds of things that were done to prisoners in that prison, and it's because they wanted to break Christians in particular, because Christians were deemed a threat to the communist state, and for good reason. It's because they don't acknowledge the state as supreme. They see God as supreme over the state. So they tortured them in this prison, and the way they tortured them absolutely is mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing, the kind of things that they did to people there. And some of those torturers could be on a list like this. Again, torturers who would have killed millions of people if it had been within their power to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope that you will join the Posse. That is the people who are partnering with us in this show. And the way you can do that is by going to join.LarryTaunton. That's TAUNTON, join.LarryTaunton.com. Join the Posse and help us to grow this podcast, because we feel like we're doing some pretty amazing things here, and we'd love to have you as a part of it. There's been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.